And so it was this big deal, this astronomer at a small school discovering something that nobody's ever discovered before. Now, in the long run, it turned out that he got some numbers wrong because some of the data that he used was published with errors in it. And only later did somebody figure out that there were errors in the data, so his prediction was off. But still, there's this film about this whole story, and they interviewed me for a couple of things in the film. And so it was a professional filmmaker shooting me, and I got multiple takes. He'd ask me a question, and I'd answer it, and he'd say, you weren't quite clear here, could you try again? Or I'd start, and I'd say, I mucked that up, so I'd start over. And the lighting was good, and the sound was good.
Yeah, if you get a do-over.
And my guess is, where I sounded good, but I had a goofy look on my face, he would just use the audio and use some other video, and you'd hear my voice in the background. But I came out of that thinking, man, I look and sound pretty good, pretty smart. Very careful editing.
Yeah. Oh,
So, I'm pretty good.
hi.
Hi. So that she can watch that. Oh, okay.
Oh, do you, I usually don't need it, but do you have some water for me just in case?
Yes, I can get you some water, for
Thank you, I
sure.
appreciate it.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, put your feet down. We're going to take these two right there. Oh, hi, Mrs. Edenhard.
Well, compared to what I've done.
Well, come this way. It's not like we don't like you.
Oh, hey, I'm glad to hear that. Growing up Dutch. I'm Dutch.
I'm going to swing
Well, I would say I'm technically not Dutch. I'm Dutch Canadian. My parents were
You're
Dutch.
Dutch Canadian?
Yeah.
Canadian?
What does that mean? Is the Dutch more important than the
Lights
Canadian?
go on.
It depends on the day.
Oh,
The one thing I knew growing up as a person whose parents were from the Netherlands and who was born in Canada, the one thing I knew, I was not a Yankee. Even though I was born here. I was born here while my father was at the seminary. So I'm an American too.
Wow.
And I've lived in the United States now for over 20 years, so
Really?
yep.
So can you come here a minute?
Yeah.
Do you, I have a hearing problem.
Oh, sure.
Do you know where your parents are born?
Yes, they were both born in the province of Drenthe.
Drenthe. I come from Groningen.
And from the same little area. My mother was born in one village and my father was born in a village maybe 10 miles down the road. And then the two families, my mother's side
Summer and winter.
immigrated to Canada.
This is not my normal
in
attire.
1955. My father's side in 1955, but they ended up in the same little town in Ontario, in Canada. Eventually met about
Wow. So, do you speak some Dutch?
very, very little.
Klein beetje.
Een klein beetje. I'm pretty
Well,
fluent with the bad words.
I was born there. I
Yeah.
was 24 when they came.
Ah, okay.
So, and my children are born here.
Yeah.
And my son, the oldest son, he speaks and reads and everything in Dutch.
Wow.
And he's the editor of the,
It's been a long time.
Oh, sure.
yeah.
It's probably been
What's
a
his
long
name?
COVID time.
Aaron Vanderpool, yep, I know him.
Oh, really?
Yep.
You go to church?
I go to
How are
COS,
you?
yep, so I know him.
yeah, they do.
Yeah. And Aaron published a story that I wrote in DIS last year.
Yeah, so he will be 67 and he wants to quit.
Yeah.
I had enough, I've done it for 36 years and that's it.
And is that his only work right now, or does he do other work as well?
No, well, he's a computer.
Yeah, I knew that.
That was that. So, but his wife, Carol, graduate, not graduate.
Then I kept
She's retired.
Yeah.
And so now wants to travel.
Yeah.
I didn't take any
Went to Denver.
Yeah.
That's
Oh, nice. Wow.
That was it. I went to Denver.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I
she's-
saw her.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. She's good, yeah. And there's another guy, a young man, who's also quite good. But yeah, she's good. And she's got that lovely Irish accent.
I
was thinking it's probably really good introducing us today. It was a fun dress.
It's English.
Yeah, it's, yeah, I can hear the difference between English, Irish, and
You're
Scottish.
presenting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's working.
Yes.
I've seen you before.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's very nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mother was a little girl, she was 9, and my father was 18. So my mother had no accent by the time she was an adult. My father had just a little bit. Yeah. And I could hear a little bit in you.
Yes. That's good. I think you
Oh, no. Yes. Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so
Oh, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think it's much more rare now. Yes, they did. Well, and the idea was that the Free University was a university built by Abraham Kuyper, who was a big man. And they had fear that theology in the United States was too American, it wasn't reformed enough, and they wanted to go to a properly reformed Christian university where they would
Being very careful.
education there. Whereas I think eventually, as they became more American, they became more comfortable going to American universities, and eventually they began to believe that free university had become too liberal in its theology. But still, I have a couple of colleagues who studied PhDs at the Free University. Although I think they're all retired.
You gotta get down there to see.
And that was one. Yeah.
It's on there, yeah.
Yes.
I think I'm being to stand right behind it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to, move over here, you can take it off.
My mother's side of the family, they were in the Netherlands, Katerberg. My father's side was Curator. But in Canada, with my grandfather, I'll show you, you'll see a picture in a few minutes. He joined the Christian Reformed Church because that was the only one. Well, he helped start one of the churches. Great to meet you. I'm looking forward to it.
People are not sure about Lucas, but it is done.
Well, I think it's on top of them. Where did he go? He's singing. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, all right, make it 4.
Yeah.
You might as well. You just go here and chat. Well, see, I didn't even see it better without my glasses. One more minute.
Instead of That's
They didn't get lost.
Maybe somebody stopped and talked or something. It's on. Yeah, it's on. Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this program. This afternoon, I am very privileged to introduce someone that I've got to know really well because I spent a lot of time in the archives. And Professor Dr. William Katerberg, he grew up in Canada, where his father was a Christian Reformed minister. So he will tell you a little bit about himself and growing up there. He graduated from Calvin University, then college in 1999, and went on to 1988. Oh, way back 88. You came to Calvin in 1999. Okay, God is. You don't look that old. Got his master's from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana and his PhD from Queen's University in Canada. So Will has published a number of books, blogs, and articles. And you may have read some of those in recent issues of the Banner. And if not, I would say go back, find your old banners. You don't throw your banners away. and read those articles, they're really good. Will joined the Calvin University History Department in 1999. And in February 2019, he was appointed as the interim curator of the archives. And then was appointed as the full-time curator 2 years later, 2020. So his knowledge of the Christian Reformed Church in Canada and the United States is vast. His knowledge of the Calvin University and the Seminary is equally vast. So he is the exact perfect person to be our curator in the archives. And I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you have been in the Heritage Hall? Oh, that's wonderful. So you know, but you don't know the whole story, which you will get right now from looking at it. Let's give them a big hand.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Janet. The only correction I would make is, rather than vast, I would describe it as growing knowledge.
Oh, okay.
And I'll explain the difference and why, for me, it's important to acknowledge the difference as we go along. My original title for this talk was going to be The History of the Christian Reformed Church and the Heritage Hall Archives, but I thought, that's such a big, vast history, I really wouldn't be able to say much interesting about it and talk about the archives. So I thought, instead of talking about the history of the church, I'd talk about a little bit about my experience growing up Dutch and Reformed as the child of immigrants in Canada, and use that as a way to explain how I became the curator, how I got to be in charge of Heritage Hall. And I thought, okay, I can do that in about 40, 45, 50 minutes and make it an interesting story. So we will eventually get to Heritage Hall itself, and in the picture there, you see the main entrance to Heritage Hall, right there. There's always some displays in the window. Currently, it's a display about children's literature based on a collection that we purchased from Conrad and Dee Bolt. Conrad worked for 3-4 decades in the library, and Dee worked, if I remember right, in the financial services department. So they were long Calvin College people, and their collection now is a wonderful gift that we had there.
Not too well.
Just turn your volume up.
All right.
Okay. What's your name?
Ma'am.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
My roots, probably like many of you, if you go back far enough, are in the Netherlands. For me, it's just one generation. In the picture there, you see my mother's side of the family. I have a lot more photographs and know a lot more of that history because an aunt of mine who lives here in Grand Rapids collected it all. So that's my grandfather, Frank Vischer, as I knew him, or Opa, in the early 1920s when he was in his early 20s. And then the other picture is his family in 1949 on the eve of them leaving the Netherlands, the province of Drenthe, to go to Canada. And
The little girl you see right there is my mother, 9 years old.
Wow.
So like many Dutch farmers, at the end of World War II and when peace, came back and they were thinking about the future, my grandfather was a reasonably well-off farmer, but he thought there just wasn't enough land available for his sons to rent, let alone buy. And so they made the choice in 1949 to go to Canada. My father's side of the family, I'm mostly going to talk about my mother's side because I know the history better. My father's side of the family came to Canada, also from the province of Drenthe, from the same little area that my mother's family was from, in 1955. Both families ended up in Drayton, Ontario, which is a small town near Kitchener, or about an hour west of Toronto, where they eventually met and eventually married. When they arrived in Canada, they ended up in Drayton because there was the promise of a church there. My grandfather said when they were deciding to go to Canada, if we can't find a church that is suitable for us, then we can't go. And so he was in regular contact with a minister named Charles Spoelhoff, who was born in the United States but was fluent in Dutch and was working as a field agent for the Christian Reformed Church. He led a church in the Kitchener area, and he helped recruit and settle immigrants like my grandfather. So when my grandfather arrived with the family in April 1949, a Mennonite farmer and minister met them at the train station and brought them to the little town of Drayton and set them up on one of his 2 farms. About a year later, my grandfather bought the farm from him. And as I said, about 7 years later, my father's side of the family came over. So I grew up an immigrant kid. My parents were both immigrants. My father had a fairly noticeable accent. My mother not so much because she was just a little girl when she came. But everybody, almost everybody, all the parents I grew up with had a Dutch accent. The ministers I heard in church had a Dutch accent. So as a child, I probably assumed that God spoke English with a Dutch accent. It was just part of the day-to-day life. The food, the accents, all the little Dutch references. That was part of growing up Reformed for me. I don't think I would have ever imagined that being Reformed was distinct from being Dutch. It came as a package for me. After church, these were Dutch immigrants. We didn't have communion every Sunday. We had that 4 times a year, as was common in the 1960s and 70s. But I remember thinking, even as a kid, we had our own sort of communion after church every Sunday, which was coffee and a cigarette. These were Dutch immigrants just off the boat, and at least half of the men smoked and probably a third of the women. And so after church, you'd see people, they'd go get their coffee, they'd go back outside, light up a cigarette, and start talking. And then I can remember the caretaker of the church waiting impatiently for them all to finish their cigarettes and leave so he could sweep them up and have things all cleaned up for the afternoon service. And as a kid, that upbringing really shaped my sense of who I was. I remember parents, and even sometimes fellow kids my own age, saying things like, I'll do it like the parents would have with a Dutch accent, "Och ja, she's marrying a Canadian boy." In other words, not one of us, right? Or he's marrying a Canadian girl, not one of us. So a lot of the time growing up, even though I was Canadian, we thought of ourselves as not Canadian, but Dutch. Unless it was hockey night in Canada, or the Canadian national hockey team was playing the Americans, then we were Canadian. So I had this dual sense of identity, Dutch and not Canadian, Canadian, not American. For me, that got complicated as well, because my father was a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, and I was born in Grand Rapids while he was studying at the seminary. So I was born in Blodgett Memorial Hospital. So I also grew up knowing I was an American citizen, and my fellow Dutch-Canadian classmates would occasionally tease me and call me a Yankee. Now, the importance of that story for my talk today is 2 or 3 things. One, when I went to graduate school to become a historian, one of the things I was fascinated with was Canadian-American relations. How did the 2 countries differ? How were they similar? Because I'd grown up as a kid born in the United States, living in a Dutch immigrant community in Canada. So I had this sense that I was American, I was Canadian, and I was Dutch. So when I went to graduate school, I wanted to study the history of how the United States and Canada compare. How are their politics similar? How are they different? How are their immigration stories similar? Where are they different? How do their national identities compare? I was also interested in the history of ethnicity. I grew up a Dutch immigrant kid, so I was interested in immigration. I never studied immigrants themselves until I got this job in the archives. I was more interested in simply the relationship between ethnic identity, for me being Dutch, and religious identity, me being Reformed, and interested in how national identities connected with religious identities. Now, I do remember distinctly when I was in grad school, people would ask me, are you going to study Dutch Reformed history in Canada and the United States? And I remember thinking, no, I was definitely not going to do that. I grew up in that community, and it was kind of refreshing, to get away from it a little bit and study something else. So instead, I did my PhD on Anglicans, fellow Protestants, an English tradition, and it was a way for me to explore these things: national identity, religious identity, ethnic traditions, but rather than my own, exploring someone else's. And so my PhD was on Anglicanism and Episcopalianism in the United States and Canada. Since then, I'll show you some book covers in a minute. I've studied the history of the American West. I've studied the history of, I guess you'd say, opposition to and criticism of immigration by native-born Americans and native-born Canadians. And I've written about a variety of other things. And I think just once before I became the curator at Heritage Hall, did I write anything about Dutch Canadian and Dutch American history. And I did that for you'll have to help me make sure I get this right, Janet. The American Association for, what is ADAS?
ADAS is the Association for the Advancement of Dutch American Studies.
Thank you. I knew the two A's weren't American. So the Association for the Advancement of Dutch American Studies. I gave a paper at an ADAS conference once, and that was the only time before I started in Heritage Hall that I actually wrote something about Dutch American and Dutch Canadian history. So I was asked to become the curator of Heritage Hall, as Janet said, on a part-time basis because the position had been empty for a year and they were still trying to figure out a few things before they would hire a person full-time. And they asked me to step in. They figured, he's a historian. Heritage Hall has historical stuff. I'd been the chair of the history department and the chair of the communication department, and I'd been a dean in the provost office, and they said, oh, he knows how to be an administrator. We'll put him in charge for a year or so. And then I ended up with the job. So here I was in my early to mid-50s and starting a completely new career. I know how to be a historian. I'm a good historian. I can write really, really well. But I don't know a whole lot about being an archivist. And so, I'm learning new stuff, which is a really wonderful thing. So I didn't come into Heritage Hall having studied Dutch American or Dutch Canadian history, but I grew up in the middle of all of that stuff. I grew up an immigrant kid, and my whole upbringing, the grocery store we went to, the mechanic we went to, the hairdresser or the barber we went to, the insurance salesman my parents went to, the neighborhood kids I played with, it was a world defined 90% of the time by fellow Dutch immigrants and their children. And even some of the kids my own age were themselves immigrants and spoke with English with a Dutch accent. So this is the world I grew up in. So coming into Heritage Hall, I have a long history of studying religion in North America, studying ethnicity and immigration and opposition to immigration in North America, and then my personal experience growing up in this Dutch Reformed world. And that's what I brought to Heritage Hall. And so now I have the opportunity, relatively late in my career, to learn more and more about a whole new area of history. It's a vast area, as Janet said, but I'm growing into it and thoroughly enjoying it. So when my grandfather came, he was one of the first two elders in Drayton Christian Reformed Church. And this is a picture of the church being built in 1952. And if you look right there, you can see that man is wearing wooden shoes.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You know, so a good Dutch farm boy. Growing up, we always had several pairs of Dutch shoes sitting outside the back door, so when we went to the mailbox, or if I had to go quick shovel the driveway a little bit, I would just put on a pair of wooden shoes and get to work. That's the farm that my grandfather bought from the Mennonite farmer, and one of my uncles inherited it. That's a picture from about 1954. That's my mother, right there, probably about 12 years old, and two of my aunts coming home from school. They went to a little one-room schoolhouse. The teacher there, one teacher, one school, probably about 50 students. She just set all the immigrant kids back about 3 grades with the assumption that they'd eventually learn English and catch up. I think my mother and her 2 older sisters and brother all quit school as soon as they could, about 14, 15, 16 years old. And by the time she was 16, my mother was running the household. You know, her mother had gotten sick, so my mother took over. She raised her younger sisters, while the older girls all went out and got jobs to bring money in for the family. So the picture again shows my mother. There you see her. And that's my Aunt Hilly. She's a lovely person, but she loves teasing people, and there she's teasing my mother, and my mother's getting annoyed. The reason why I showed the picture is the magazine. If you see it right there, if you came up close, you'd be able to see that it's called Calvinist Contact. Calvinist Contact was a magazine started by Dutch Canadian immigrants, Dutch Reformed immigrants to Canada, to literally do what the title says, keep in contact with each other. So in that magazine, and I remember reading it in the 1970s and 80s, it was still in a mix of Dutch and English, and it had stories about immigrants, advertisements for Christian schools looking for teachers or for principals, immigrant men or young men or women looking for someone to correspond with the eye to marrying. One of my favorite ads was from 1982, so that late, and it was from a young farmer, about 39 years old, I think he said he was 39, and he was looking for a strong young woman who was willing to work hard to become his wife. I don't know, but I like to think he found her. Or maybe she found him. Last January, I got a phone call and then an email from a man who'd done that kind of correspondence with a young woman. He was from Saskatchewan, so the Canadian West. His wife, well, then this young woman he didn't know, was living in Ontario, and he put an ad, or maybe it was her, one of them put out an ad looking to correspond with someone. They corresponded for a few months and decided to get married. They'd never seen a picture of each other, but they met in the train station in Toronto, and they emailed me about 50 years later trying to find that advertisement. We couldn't find it back. I don't know if it was advertised somewhere else, or if they just had the information wrong, but we couldn't find it. But you know, that's the world I grew up in. I remember Calvinist Contact. It was a window into the immigrant world, but like a good Reformed newspaper, it also had Reformed perspectives on what was going on in the wider world. And so the article there is about a cabinet crisis in the Dutch government. I remember articles in the 1980s when I was a high school student, and there'd be a story about the new constitution in Canada, and at the bottom of the page, Christian high schools getting computers. This is the world I lived in. And it's the experience I now bring to this job. That's my grandfather's house. When he retired, he left the farm, and he bought that house right next door to the church that he helped found. And in the picture, you see 2 of my aunts, and the man standing there is my father, about a year away from graduating from Calvin Seminary. And there's another picture of the Calvinist Contact, just from the era when I was growing up. Oh, and actually, if you look there, there's Canada Human Rights, and there's Christian schools prepare themselves for the computer. I was in school then in 1982, and I remember when we got computers, these newfangled things. What were we going to do with them? That's one of the churches my dad served when it was recently built in Wellandport, Ontario, in the middle of the Niagara Peninsula. And so I remember that area. We lived there when I was in my teens. So I remember the school. It was much bigger by the time we got there. The house had since been renovated a bunch of times and grown. But again, this is a picture of the world that I grew up in. And this photograph is one that I found in Heritage Hall. So these are some of the books that I mentioned. This is the book I wrote on Anglicanism. This is the book I wrote on the American West. And then this is the most recent thing I've written that's really kind of connected to Heritage Hall. It's about immigration. All right. But really you're here to hear about Heritage Hall. So let's get into that. So when you first enter Heritage Hall, you enter what's called the reading room. And that's where the customers, so if you've been to Heritage Hall, that's where you've done your reading and your work. If you've never been there, it's the area where patrons, kind of like customers at a restaurant where they eat. It's the front part of Heritage Hall where people who are coming to use our resources go. All right. So along the walls here and here are published materials. It's things like the Banner, the Reformed Journal, other Christian Reformed magazines and publications, Acts of Synod, Agendas of Synod, old Calvin College and Calvin Seminary course catalogs, and a wide variety of books, at least a couple of Janet's books, published about Dutch American or Reformed history. And so published work is mostly what you find in the reading room. I like to point this out. This is the desk of Ac Venralty, who was the founder of the first Dutch colony in Michigan and Holland. And you might wonder, why do we have that here at Calvin rather than at Hope College, which he helped found? Well, it's because the descendants of Venralty were unhappy with Hope College in the city of Holland at the time. So when they decided to donate their materials somewhere to kind of, show their anger to the city of Holland and Hope College, they donated it to Calvin College in Grand Rapids instead. So a little bit of frustration and anger and revenge on the part of the Venralty family means that we have these. In a spirit of good relations, we gave copies of the material to Hope College. One of the things I wanted to show you, so if you've never been to Heritage Hall, one of the best reasons to come is that we've got wonderful resources related to family history and genealogy. So the collection you see here, all the boxes, are boxes of family history and genealogy. So people not always doing the work at Heritage Hall, but often doing the work at Heritage Hall, compile their family histories, tracing, their parents, great-grandparents, sometimes back as far as the early 1800s or even the 1700s. For some of them, it's just that family history information, but a lot of people have written their family's histories as well and told some of the stories going back to the Netherlands, of emigrating to the United States or Canada, and then what's happened to their families since then. So one of the things you can do when you come to Heritage Hall is see if anybody's written a story about your family, or maybe a different branch of your family. You might be a Westra or De Vries or something, and it may not be your branch of the De Vrieses or Westras, but one related to you. So you can often get started with your family's history, or you can take a peek at other people's family histories by looking at that collection. This old card catalog is also interesting. Over the years, volunteers and staff at Heritage Hall have taken material from the Banner and De Wachter and occasionally other sources like that related to wedding anniversaries, obituaries. In electronic versions, we also have baptism announcements. And so with that card catalog, or with electronic documents, so PDFs and things you'd use on the computer, you can find a ton of history about potentially your family backgrounds, but about the backgrounds of immigrants. And that can help you put together your birth announcements. So in one of those databases, you find the birth announcements for my two sisters. I'm not in there. I think my parents were probably a little too poor because they were still students at the time. But by the time my two sisters were born, my dad was working as a minister, and they could afford to put those birth announcements in Calvinist Contact. And I think maybe there was a wedding anniversary announcement when my parents had their 25th wedding anniversary in the Banner. So there's some really, really rich family history resources, whether it's of your family or your in-laws side of the family, or friends. And so it's a wonderful resource you can use. All right, so let me go back here. So the things in the reading room that we have, or that you can access online, are things like this. Online, on the Calvin College Heckman Library website, there's an index of every well, not every, but all the major magazines published related to the Christian Reformed Church. So the Banner, the Reformed Journal, Outlook, Torch and Trumpet, and probably about 15, 20 other magazines. Origins, the magazine that Heritage Hall publishes, is indexed in there as well. So you can do, if you're interested in a topic related to Dutch American, Dutch Canadian, or Dutch Reformed history, you can do searches for authors, for topics, and you can find stories. The index doesn't include the stories. For that, you need to come to Heritage Hall, and we can help you find them in the magazines on the shelves. And as I've already described, all the books and magazines and genealogies that you can use in Heritage Hall. It's a great way to do some research on your family or on your favorite topics related to the history of immigration and Dutch Americans or Reformed Christianity. But all of this is the front of the house. I like to use that phrase because it's kind of like being at a restaurant. You know, as a customer, you get the food brought out to you. You generally don't get to go into the kitchen where the food is being prepared. Well, the archives work similarly. If you want to use some of our unpublished materials, and the only place they exist in the world often is in Heritage Hall, they're in the back. We don't let you into the back. Well, we let Janet in the back. She just marches in like she owns the place. And that's okay because she's as much a colleague and has at times been an employee. So I that's welcome. I love giving tours, so if you come to Heritage Hall and we're not too busy, I can give you a tour of the back area as well. But I'll give you a virtual one now. So in the back of the house, when material comes into Heritage Hall, so recently I've gotten donations from Davis Young. He's a former geology professor at Calvin. He and some of his colleagues were quite controversial in the 1980s. They wrote a lot of things about the relationship between science and religion, and in particular they talked about and wrote about the question of evolution and how the science of evolution relates to biblical accounts of creation. And recently, like many people, he's downsizing, and so he wants to get rid of many of his papers, and he's donated them to Heritage Hall. Books, publications, research materials, and as you might expect, lots and lots of letters that he received about his book. Some people who were writing to thank him for the books and to praise him and to tell him how much they appreciated what he wrote. Other people writing more critically, explaining why they were unhappy or why they disagreed with him. When he donated his papers, he said, "Wait for one of the boxes, there's a book in an envelope, you'll be interested when you see it." I said, "Oh, what? Is it from an unhappy person who scrawled all sorts of things over it about why he or she was unhappy?" And he said, "Just wait, you'll know it when you see it." So I got a box of material and I was taking a quick look at it and I saw an envelope and I thought, oh, this must be the envelope. I opened the envelope and saw a book and a letter, pulled out the letter, and it was an angry letter by a man who was unhappy with the book, and he explained in detail why he was unhappy and disappointed that Davis Young had published the book and disappointed that Calvin had let him publish the book. And then I thought, oh, I want to see what the person had written in the book. So I pulled it out and only half came out. The person had torn the book in half and mailed it back to Davis Young saying he didn't want to bring it to a used bookstore because he thought then somebody else would read it. And maybe he'd let us read by it. And so the book itself isn't anything special. We've probably got a half a dozen copies in the library. What makes this one special as an artifact is that somebody mailed it back to Davis Young and tore it in half.
Oh my word.
So when you look at what can sometimes look like dry, dusty documents in an archives, it's important to remember that there's a lot of passion and a lot of ideas behind them. We have dozens and dozens of boxes of immigrant letters from the Netherlands, or 2 people in the Netherlands, from Germany, or 2 people in Germany, and think of all the family history in those letters, and all the memories of people who'd left the Netherlands, or all the ways that people who'd left or their families in the Netherlands missed each other, and you can find those stories in those letters. Well, in the case of this letter and this book, it was the emotions of a very unhappy man who was angry with Davis Young for what he'd written. Well, when material like that comes to us, whether it's from an individual like Davis Young or from a department at Calvin College, we bring it in, and then we organize it, put it in boxes, and then add the information about the material to a catalog of material. Heritage Hall takes in material of 4 kinds. We're the archives for the Christian Reformed Church, so we get official records from the Christian Reformed Church, and not just the denomination, but also all the local congregations. So it's really fun for me to go see the material from the congregations where my dad was a preacher and or where I was a member. And I'm regularly doing research, helping people who want to know something about their church's history. The second major collection we have is material records from Calvin Theological Seminary. The third major one, as I've suggested, is the records of Calvin College, now Calvin University. And then we've got a fourth set of collections, and that's the papers of individuals like Davis Young, Nicholas Wolterstorff, George Marsden, so former professors from the college, the seminary, former pastors and leaders in the Christian Reformed Church, and then many, many graduates of Calvin College. Infamous ones like Paul Schrader, the filmmaker, who was controversial. A generation or two earlier, Peter de Vries, Minder de Young, David de Young, writers from the late 1920s and 30s who were controversial, and then many, many organizations, Christian schools, and the Christian Farmers Federation of Ontario. So there's a wealth of the history of immigration and the things that Dutch Americans and Dutch Canadians have done in North America. Not just the history of the church, not just the history of immigration, but of schools and hospitals, farmers' federations and labor unions. Marvelous, marvelous stuff. So let me show you some pictures of that. So this is what the archives looks like in the back. What you see here is archival boxes. So in those archival boxes, you'll find papers, sermons, speeches, letters, committee records, student transcripts, all sorts of kinds of material. We probably have about 6,000 or 7,000 boxes like that of material. What you see here, these are mobile shelves. So to cram in as many shelves as possible, they don't have fixed spaces between them, but you crank a wheel and a space will open up. And so you can open up just a space for the aisle you need to go down, and that closes all the other spaces between there. And in that collection, we have rare books. That includes a children's collection, the one that we purchased from D. and Conrad Bolt that I told you about. We have a collection that was donated to us by John Bolt, a seminary professor, and it's rich in Dutch Reformed theology, so Abraham Kuyper, Herman Bavinck, so Reformed thinkers and leaders from both North America and the Netherlands. A wide variety of faculty publications where these are books that are also available on the shelves and people can check out, but we want to keep a clean copy of most faculty publication books as well in the rare books. And then a wide variety of other old books and artifacts that are really hard to find. For example, we have about 250, I think, old Bibles going back to as early as the mid-1500s. And a lot of these Bibles are Dutch language Bibles, Staten Bibles. Are you familiar with the Staten Bible? Okay. Are you familiar with the King James Bible? Okay. So the Staten Bible is the Dutch version of the King James Bible. And a lot of families brought them with them, and they inherited these big Bibles. And eventually, nobody in the family can read them anymore because they're in Dutch. And it's this big Bible, and the great-grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren aren't sure what to do with the Bible, so they ask if they can donate it to us. And if it's a version that we don't have and it's in good condition, we'll take it. If it's a version that we have 2 or 3 of already, we try to help them find a home for it. This area is where a lot of the staff and volunteers work. And so right now I have 2 volunteers, Clarice Newhoff and Phil Erfmeyer, who come in twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Phil Erfmeyer helps process minutes from church councils and elders meetings and deacons meetings, and he does a little bit of other processing of material related to the Christian Reformed Church. Clarice is on the computer cataloging the probably 10,000 photographs that we have, so they do really good work. I also have 3 student workers there. One, Peter Mao, he's the grandson of Richard Mao, who you may know, or at least may have read of. He does a lot of basic work for the archives, developing our electronic catalogs so that people can search what we have on their computers. I have a student named John Meyer who's working with me on a project related to Dutch immigration, and that's going to be published online eventually. And then another student, Gabby Freshley, who's working with me on some of the history of the Christian Reformed Church, doing research. Right now she's doing research on Navajo Christians in the Christian Reformed Church. And then I have regular staff, two staff, Emily and Lori, and they both do a wide variety of kinds of work. As material comes in, they help organize it and catalog it so that when someone needs it, they can find it and we can get it to them. So we don't just collect the material, though. So we take in the material that when you look at it and research it, you can tell the histories of Dutch immigration, the evolution of Dutch communities like Grand Rapids or Holland, Michigan, or Pella, Iowa, or Drayton, Ontario, where both my parents eventually emigrated. Or you can tell the stories of the church, the seminary, the college, and a wide variety of other things related to Dutch Reformed history in North America, or the history of Grand Rapids and Michigan. We don't just have the raw materials, we do a lot of storytelling too. I think that the biggest part of my job, for me certainly the most interesting part of my job that I have a lot of experience with, is publishing the magazine Origins. Origins has since 1983, I think, been publishing the history of Dutch immigration, the stories of emerging Dutch American and Dutch Canadian communities, the histories of the college, seminary, and university. And I think we're now in our 40th year of publishing. I think this year is volume 40. And so I've taken that over. And I thoroughly enjoy it. I've written a lot of books that are written for scholars like me, and I've published a lot of magazine articles and journal articles that are written for scholars like me. What I love about Origins is that I'm writing for ordinary people. Not just scholars, but people who are simply interested in the history of Reformed Christianity, the history of Dutch communities and Dutch immigration in North America, and telling a wide variety of those kinds of stories. And those stories are getting wider and more diverse. The Christian Reformed Church today has a large Korean immigrant community. And I find the parallels between the Korean immigrant experience and the Dutch immigrant experience really, really interesting. So it's a living history. It's living and breathing and growing. One of the things I've written about is the history of the American West. And so one of the Christian Reformed stories I'm drawn to is the history of missions by the Christian Reformed Church to Navajo and Zuni people in the American Southwest. And I'm really interested in looking at the story from both the missionaries' perspective, how they experienced it, but also from the Navajo and Zuni perspective and how they experienced it. And so it's a really rich opportunity for me, not just to publish the stories of other people. Janet has something coming out in the next issue. James Scott, who some of you may have read, has something in the next issue. So there's always wonderful material. I have something coming out in the next issue too, about my grandfather and his family, actually. It's not just the opportunity for me to write the history myself, but for all sorts of other people. Right now I have people who are working on essays related to a wide variety of topics who aren't scholars. They're not paid to do this. They're just interested. And even if they don't get it published, they just want to do the research and do some writing. But I think there's some good potential for some publications in what those people are working on. So if you've not ever read Origins, come to Heritage Hall. And you can take a look at some recent copies. We've got back issues, and we've got so many that I'm happy to give some away. So you can come to Heritage Hall, and I can give you something to take home. If you're comfortable using the computer, and if you don't mind reading on a computer, we also have a blog. So Origins Online. Origins articles are about 6-7 pages, about 3,000-4,000 words, whereas blog posts on the blog are about 1,000 words. So they're much shorter stories, and sometimes those short stories get lengthened and published in the paper version. So you can go to the Origins blog, And you can see the address there. I can leave the address with Janet, and if you want to ask anyone, you can get it from her. But the nice thing about it, the really nice thing, is if you look in the top corner, so right there it says Origins in Print. And if you go there, you can see all of the back issues to about 2015. So, 35 years from 1983 to 2015, you can see, 30 years of articles. So it's a wonderful resource for all sorts of aspects of Dutch American and history and the history of Reformed Christianity. Finally, I thought I'd show you just a couple of screens for two reasons. One, for those of you who don't mind doing research on computers and reading on computers, this is a gateway to finding stuff about Heritage Hall and what we have in Heritage Hall. So if you go to the library website at Calvin University, and you go here, it says Find Databases. All you do is type in CRC, and you get two options. One is the Christian Reformed Ministers Database, and if you want to look for pastors that you once had and that you remember, or pastors that you know, if you want to look at the background of your own pastor, you can do a search for a name. So there's the Christian Reformed Ministers Database. So you type in a name right here. I typed in my father's name. So there he is, Henry Katerberg. And then you click on that, and it shows a picture, usually a retirement age picture if it's someone who's retired. If it's a younger, more recent pastor, probably the pastor when she or he graduated, probably the photograph when they graduated. But it gives you the history of the churches they served in, where they got their degrees, where they studied, where they were born, things like that. So it's a wonderful little resource. If you type in CRC here, the other thing you get is the CRC Periodicals, or the CRC Magazines Index. So if you want to see if there's a story about someone you know, or about a topic you're interested in the banner, you can go there and find it, and then you can come to Heritage Hall, and we'll get the article to you. It's really nice to do that because you can do a little bit of looking yourself before you come to Heritage Hall, and then you'll have an idea of what you can find when you get to Heritage Hall. There are all sorts of other resources. So this is if you go to the library homepage, that can bring you to the Heritage Hall homepage, and there you can get all sorts of resources related to the Christian Reformed Church and Dutch American history. So you have a bunch of choices at the top there. You can get to all the old acts of synod and agendas of synod. There's access to our Dutch letters collection. Most of it's just a list, but in some cases the actual Dutch letters are there. Usually they're ones that have been translated into English. All sorts of, there's research material related to genealogy. You can figure out the kinds of things that we have there and get access to some of the things that are available electronically. And then finally, you can search what we have in the archives itself. So this is a website that allows you to see what's in all of those boxes. Remember the 7,000 boxes I mentioned? Well, this is a way of seeing what's in there. So one of my favorite characters in Dutch American and Christian Reformed history is Johanna Bienstra, the missionary. She was the first woman missionary related to the Christian Reformed Church. She went to Nigeria in the early 1920s. At that point, the Christian Reformed Church didn't support her. It was reluctant to go into Africa. It was putting its resources into China at the time. It also wasn't sure whether it wanted to support women missionaries yet. But Johanna Bienstra went and worked with another mission group, and the mission was so successful, the church very quickly decided it was going to start sponsoring missions in Africa, and it started sponsoring Johanna Bienstra. And she's now a famous character in Christian Reformed and Calvin College lore. Generations of Calvin students have lived in the Bienstra dorm. So when you type in Bienstra's name, you get some hits, and if you click on those, it takes you to places where you can find material about her. So you see that? And then eventually you can find the Johanna Bienstra collection, and a couple clicks later, you get a summary of her life and then a list of all the things that are in the boxes related to Johanna Bienstra. Letters, clothing, medical equipment, reports and articles she wrote related to her ministry.
Wow.
So it's a treasure trove of material. And I'd love to be able to take the time now to answer some questions you might have. And anytime you want to come visit, there will be somebody there to help you find things that you'll be interested in.
Okay. I think you can hear me. Anyone have a question? Garrett says they can't hear. How do we get this out there? Okay. Yes, definitely. So, any of you have a question, I'm going to give you this mic so that we can all hear. Okay?
I can probably, can you hear me if I talk like this? Okay, good.
You can hear the question.
No, you can't? Okay.
Here, I'll get you another mic.
Okay.
Okay. What do you want to add?
Okay. With your great experience as a Canadian and U.S. side of the border and the different issues, would you care to comment on the current situation in terms of the Canadian church and the relationship to the government in the U.S. side? There are interesting angles to this thing, and I'm not sure how much you would care to say, but it's a very current question with a lot of feelings.
Well, going straight for the controversy, trying to get me in trouble. So I'm happy to say a few things. First, I'll talk as a historian. So when I first started paying attention to this question, what should the relationship be between the Canadian wing of the church and the American wing of the church, I decided to do some background research. And John Crominga, who was, I don't think he was the president of the seminary yet, but this was in the mid-1950s. He was a professor at the seminary. He was leading the programming for the centennial of the Christian Reformed Church in 1957. So he had become president. By 1957, John Crominga was the president. And he published several articles in the Reformed Journal about the Canada question. And there had already been reports from church leaders in Canada, including, interestingly, some American pastors who'd been organizing churches in Canada. And some of those Dutch Canadians, and interestingly, as I said, American pastors who were helping them organize in Canada, were recommending, or at least raising the question, should there be sort of a binational church, a relatively independent Canadian wing and a relatively independent American wing, or should it be a strongly unified church? So John Crominga then, as president and as a historian, wrote about this, and he didn't make a strong recommendation saying we should do this, but interestingly, he suggested that it was inevitable and that it was a good idea that it become a binational church, not totally disconnected, but not unified in a sort of a generic way that you need to recognize the differences between Canada and the United States. And so the things that Crominga pointed out were stuff like this. He said, as Dutch immigrants to Canada assimilate or acculturate, they're not going to assimilate and acculturate as Americans, but as Canadians. And quite naturally, just like Dutch folk eventually became proud Americans who said, I'm a Dutch American, I love my Dutch ethnic roots, and I'm a proud American, you're going to have Canadians who say, I'm proud of my Dutch ethnic roots and I'm a proud Canadian. And Crominga said there are real differences, important differences between Canada and the United States. Canada is binational. A French province and large groups of French speakers in other provinces, and English speaking. The Canadian political tradition, Canadian political values. There's always been a stronger, at least since the 1930s, a stronger left-wing presence in Canadian politics than in the United States. And even being liberal or progressive or conservative in Canada looks different than the United States. And so Crominga, he doesn't make a strong recommendation, but he implies pretty strongly we need to respect these differences if we're going to have a healthy relationship between the American and the emerging Canadian wings of the church. And so he recommended binational structures as well as, continental unifying structures. And in many ways, that's where we are today, it seems to me, that the differences between the Canadian and American wings of the church in terms of both sensibilities, we might say. You know, Canadians look at healthcare in the United States and are baffled at the complicated system we have here, where there are still a lot of people who aren't covered or not fully covered. Canadians, I talk about this with my family in Canada. Both my sisters live in Canada, and almost all of my cousins and aunts and uncles live in Canada. And they look at American politics, and they're kind of baffled by some aspects of it. Lots of other Canadians, support the most conservative people in the United States, but in general, Canadians are a little bit more centrist or lean a little bit more liberal or left, and some of those differences play out in the Christian Reformed Church. Just the political system is different in Canada. So the Canadian Church has a committee for contact with the government in Canada, and church denominations in Canada generally have those kinds of committees, and government officials have more regular contact with church officials and vice versa. And so there's a much stronger tradition there, despite the fact that Canada in some ways is more secular than the United States. There's also a stronger tradition of interaction, not just between political and religious sensibilities, but between political and church institutions. And so for all of those reasons, it seems to me, what's been happening in the last decade is a growing desire on the part of Canadians for a bit more independence or room to work within a Canadian political system, and the belief that having different structures or more room for different structures in Canada and in the United States will enable that. But just like there's a growing divide in the United States between left and right, there's a growing divide or just different sensibilities about social and political issues between the Canadian and American wings. And so I really think the debate is over what should this greater flexibility look like. I read online and in the Banner and in Calvinist, well, it used to be called Calvinist Contact, now it's called Christian Courier. They changed the name because they wanted it to appeal to a broader swath of Canadian Christians. But in many ways, it's the same magazine with the same writers and the same sensibility, just a bit more ecumenical. But there's a lot of articles in Christian Courier as well. And the sense that I get is that most people seem to agree we need to have more flexibility for the American wing of the church and American culture and how religion and politics and church and political institutions are related to work as is suitable here, and for Canadians to have the same there, but trying to find a way to yet maintain a good deal of solidarity and cooperation so that we don't really become two separate churches. So I suppose another final thing I'll say about that is it partly reflects the issues that the churches are debating about today. Canadians are on average a little bit different from Americans, but it also reflects what Crominga and others were commenting on already in the 1950s. In the early 1950s, there were about a half a dozen Christian Reformed churches in Canada, maybe a couple of thousand Christian Reformed people. By the end of the century, there were over 200,000 Dutch Canadians. I'm trying to remember the number in the Christian Reformed Church. I can't remember that off the top of my head. But dozens and dozens and dozens of, I think about 10 classes, so probably 150 to 200 congregations in Canada. So you can do the math, tens of thousands of members of the Christian Reformed Church in Canada. And already in the 1950s, they were predicting there would be a need to think carefully and effectively about how to be binational. And really, I think that's the deepest story. Whatever the current issues are, it's really a playing out of a story that goes back to the 1950s.
Okay, hope you got your answer. Anyone else? Oh, way over here. You got a question? Maybe over here.
You're gonna get your steps in. My mother would be 116 years old, and I have her 8th grade class graduation picture from Crescent Christian Grade School. Nobody wants that picture. Is that something Heritage Hall would take?
We take pictures. So there are some things when people say to me, will you take, I start to put on my smooth diplomat's voice and say, well, maybe, yes, no, we'll have to take a look. Pictures we take. because we always get people asking for pictures of the Christian schools, and if you have class pictures, that's nice. If it's pictures of an individual student, that's nice. So yes.
Well, I vaguely remember that the little white wooden building was still on Leonard Street, and that, of course, was abandoned, and Creston Christian Grade School was built further northeast. And now, of course, I think the building is there, but that's part of the whole Christian school. But anyway, I look at that every so often and think, I just can't throw it away. What am I going to do with it?
Well, here's what we can do. We can make a bargain right here. I'll take the original.
Okay.
I'll scan it, high quality scan, and then I'll print you a copy. And I can keep the original, and you could have a printed copy.
Okay. I'll come visit you someday.
That sounds good.
It's a great deal. So if you got something up in your closet yet, that's really historical of those things.
And then you'll see whether I make the face I made there that just says yes, or the face that says, oh, maybe.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone else? Bob?
Just a comment. Heritage Hall gave me a new lease of life because of Janet with genealogy and some of the history things that I was able to develop. I really appreciated it. So, thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to hear that. And I think that whatever may change, always finding people, whether it's when they're younger or when they're in, I can think of a guy I know who's about my age, a few years older, so he's right around 60. He's heading towards retirement, thinking about what he wants to do next, and what he's pouring himself into is his family's history. And it may lead him to becoming a volunteer in Heritage Hall as well. So I'm delighted and heartened when I hear stories like yours.
Well, that was short and sweet, so maybe one more question then? Oh, Ellen.
Has anyone replaced Henny Van Swanson?
Not yet. Nobody can replace Henny Van Swanson. When I started in Heritage Hall, I knew Henny's face because occasionally I'd gone in there, but she was just a person who worked behind the desk and a person who seemed formidable. And then I met her, and she is formidable. The knowledge, when I couldn't find something, she'd get a sparkle in her eye and say, let me show you. But she's also a wonderful person, a sweet person. So yeah, I delight in Henny. We are fine. We got permission in December to replace her position, and so we're actually combining two positions. And so her part-time position will become a full-time position, and we're in the hiring process now. One of the things that's changed in Heritage Hall, when I got there, Bob Bolt wasn't working much, but he was still occasionally coming in, and I had him as a teacher back in the 1980s. Henny was there. She'd been there since the 1980s, and I think she started in 1989. And then Lori Hahn, had been there for, I think, 10, 12 years. Bob Bolt has sadly passed away, and Henny has retired. And so I'm kind of one of the older experienced people there, and I've been there for about 3 years. So no, Henny can't be replaced. So many times when I couldn't find something, she'd say, oh, let me show you. And then I'd say, why on earth is it there? And she'd explain why. Let me give you my favorite example. I was looking for the records of a church that had left the Christian Reformed Church and joined the United Reformed Church in about 1992. And I said, it's not in there. Where is it? It says in the electronic catalog that it's there. She got a sparkle in her eye and said, let me show you. And she led me to a back corner where there were a bunch of boxes. Usually the boxes have white paper on them where the name of the town and the church is. These had yellow paper on them with the name of the town and the church. And I, what on earth's going on with this? And she said, these are all churches that left the Christian Reformed Church. And then she said, we're not segregating them because they left, but we found that people who were looking at those boxes were stealing stuff from them.
No.
So when we realized that, we decided to take all the churches that had left the CRC, separate them out with this different tags so that when somebody comes to look at them, we know to watch them like hawks. And she had no idea why people are taking it. We'd be happy to make photocopies. There's a long history of that in some fields. This is in the news right now, but a Russian example. People who study the history of communism, they try to steal from archives And the theory is they want to be the only one who has the information so they can write the book about the subject, not somebody else. I have no idea why people were taking these documents home, but we noticed, and so we've kept them carefully aside. That's my favorite Henny story.
Really interesting. Thanks so much for coming. Can we get another?
Yeah, lots of good stuff. Don't forget to go to the archives sometimes, just to find out for yourself.